Before you even blink, imagine this. A torchlight flickers against a damp castle wall. Chains rattle. Somewhere in the dark, a man laughs not in joy but madness. The smell of blood, sweat, and fear fills the air. You clicked on this video wondering if the crimes of medieval times were really as terrifying as legends say. And I'll tell you this, they were worse. Because back then, justice wasn't just cruel, it was creative. And before this video ends, you'll see why people feared not only the criminals, but the punishments meant to stop them. So stay with me till the end, because I'm going to take you deep inside the twisted minds of the most notorious criminals of the Middle Ages, men and women whose names still echo through history's darkest halls. The medieval world was a place where fear ruled more than law. Towns were small, guards were few, and darkness hid more than just secrets. Outlaws and killers roamed the roads, and every whisper of a strange disappearance brought shivers down spines. Our first stop, France, early 1400s. A war hero turned monster, Gilles de Rais. Once he was celebrated alongside Joan of Arc, fighting for faith and country, a nobleman of wealth and honor. But behind his castle doors was a nightmare no one could imagine. Witnesses spoke of children, poor boys from nearby villages, disappearing after being invited to his estate. They said Gilles promised them food, gold, even education. But when the doors closed, screams filled the stone halls. His servants said he performed rituals, mixing religion, magic, and murder in search of power. Some say he sacrificed over 100 children before anyone dared to speak up. When they finally entered his chambers, what they found was unspeakable. Blood-stained altars, burnt remains, twisted books filled with symbols no priest could recognize. And the worst part, Gilles confessed, not under torture, but almost with relief. As if the weight of his own evil had grown too heavy to carry, his trial became one of the most shocking in European history. People who once worshipped him now watched in horror as he was hanged and burned, his ashes scattered to erase his name. But here's the chilling truth. He wasn't the only one. The medieval world was crawling with minds just like his, hidden behind crowns, robes, and armor. Evil didn't always wear rags. Sometimes it wore gold. Let's move north to the misty highlands of Scotland. A family that turned the wild roads into a living nightmare, the Sawney Bean clan. Imagine this, travelers disappearing without a trace, caravans found empty, wagons overturned, and no one knowing what lurked in the cliffs above. Legends say Sawney Bean and his wife hid deep inside a coastal cave, raising a brood of children and grandchildren, all born of incest and raised as killers. Together, they hunted travelers, ambushing them under moonlight. What they did with their victims was worse than death itself. Their lair, when discovered, was piled with bones, limbs, and half-eaten remains. The Bean clan's story spread like wildfire, a tale of cannibalism so monstrous that even the bravest knights refused to travel the roads alone. Historians still debate whether the story was real or a legend used to scare people into staying close to royal protection. But either way, it worked. The fear was real. And in medieval times, fear was as good as control. And just when you think it can't get darker, let's step inside the cold stone walls of Hungary, where Countess Elizabeth Bathory ruled her castle with grace and beauty. But behind her charm was a hunger that made her one of the most feared names in history. They called her the Blood Countess. It's said she tortured and murdered hundreds of young girls, servants, peasants, anyone unlucky enough to be called to her chambers. Why? Because she believed bathing in their blood would keep her young forever. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, her legacy turned into one of the most terrifying symbols of obsession and vanity gone mad. Every name you've just heard, Gilles de Rais, Sawney Bean, Elizabeth Bathory, represents a different kind of darkness. One born from greed, another from hunger, another from vanity. But here's what you don't know yet: behind all their evil, something bigger was controlling them. A system, a belief, a fear of the church, of damnation, of power slipping away. And in the next part, we'll uncover how the society itself, The kings, the priests, the law turned into criminals in disguise. Because in the medieval world, even justice could be the cruelest crime of all. You see, in medieval times, crime wasn't always what you think it was. Sometimes, it wasn't about what you did, but who you were. The poor stole bread and got hanged. The nobles murdered for pleasure and got praised for bravery. That was the world, brutal, unfair, and soaked in hypocrisy. Let's step into the shadow of a medieval courtroom. A peasant woman stands accused of witchcraft. Her crime? She healed a child with herbs when no priest could. No evidence, no witnesses, just fear and the whispers of her jealous neighbors. The judge doesn't need proof. The church doesn't need truth. They need a confession and they'll get one. She's tied to a chair, surrounded by men in robes. Hot iron pokers glow in the corner. The inquisitor leans close and says softly, "If you are innocent, God will protect you." Hours later, the screams echo down the halls. She confesses not because she's guilty, but because pain has no faith. By morning, the village gathers to watch her burn. A lesson to all: never be different, never stand out. This wasn't rare. It was routine. Thousands of so-called witches, heretics, and healers met the same fate. Their only sin was stepping outside the boundaries of control. And here's where the real criminals hid, behind symbols of holiness and law. The priests who profited from fear. The judges who turned justice into entertainment. And the kings who turned executions into theater. One king in particular, Edward I of England, ruled with an iron fist, quite literally. He loved public executions, especially when they sent a message. Rebels weren't just killed, they were made examples of. Hung, drawn, and quartered. Their heads displayed on gates, their limbs nailed above city walls. But behind the cheers of the crowd was a darker truth. Many of those traitors were simply people who dared to question power, merchants refusing unfair taxes, farmers protecting their land. And yet, history remembers them as criminals because the victors wrote the stories. That's how the Middle Ages worked. Power decided morality, fear decided justice, and blood decided peace. Now let's travel to Italy, Florence, 15th century. The streets are alive with art and invention, but also with paranoia. A new criminal emerges, the thief of secrets. Spies who sold private letters, confessions, and inventions to rival families. One of them was a man known as Marco della Notte, Marco of the Night. He was no killer, but he destroyed lives with ink and parchment. He would sneak into homes of nobles, steal love letters, business deals, anything valuable, then sell them to enemies. When caught, the punishment was poetic. His tongue was cut out and his hands crushed in public, so he could never speak or write again. But here's what makes it chilling. The same nobles who punished him hired new thieves the very next day. In medieval times, sin was only a problem when someone else did it. And while the courts punished peasants and thieves, the church was running its own quiet empire of secrets. Monks copied forbidden texts at night. Bishops took bribes to forgive even murder. Confession, that holy act of cleansing, became currency. Imagine this. A murderer kneels before a priest, confesses his sins, and drops a pouch of gold. The priest blesses him, grants forgiveness, and the killer walks free. Justice was no longer divine. It was for sale. That's why so many so-called criminals turn to banditry, not out of evil but desperation. Because when the system fails the poor, rebellion becomes survival. One such man became a legend, Robin Hood. Was he real? Maybe not as the ballads say, but his story captured a truth everyone felt. A man who stole from the rich to feed the hungry wasn't seen as a villain. He was a hero. Because in that dark age, morality had nothing to do with law. And sometimes, breaking the law was the only moral thing left to do. But here's the twist: as the centuries rolled on, even justice began to mimic the crimes it punished. Torture became art. Punishment became spectacle, and soon the executioners themselves were treated like celebrities, feared but respected. So when you think of the most notorious criminals of the medieval world, don't just imagine murderers or thieves. Think bigger. Think of the kings who used fear to rule, the priests who sold salvation, and the laws that turned mercy into myth. Because sometimes the darkest crimes are the ones that wear crowns and crosses. You think you know crime in the Middle Ages, but what if I told you the most dangerous killers weren't hiding in forests, they were hiding in palaces? Because behind every king's smile, every priest's sermon, and every noble feast there were shadows moving silently. Assassins, poisoners, spies, the kind of people history pretends didn't exist. Welcome to the real underworld of the medieval age, where loyalty was an illusion and murder was just another business deal. Let's start in Italy, 12th century. The city-states of Florence, Venice, and Rome were dripping in gold and in blood. Everyone wanted power. Everyone feared betrayal. So the rich started hiring professionals, men trained to kill quietly, cleanly, and without question. These weren't bandits. They were the first assassins, the sicarii. Some say their name came from the short dagger they carried, hidden under cloaks. A whisper, a flick of steel, and their target would fall in the middle of a crowd, dead before anyone saw the blade. But here's the twist. They didn't always kill for money. Sometimes they killed for faith. They believed death could be holy, that removing a sinner was an act of cleansing, and that idea that killing could be justified spread fast. Now travel east with me, to the mountains of Persia, where an even deadlier group emerged, the Hashishin, or as the Crusaders called them, the Assassins. Their leader, Hassan Saba, was a man feared by empires. He built a fortress high in the mountains, Alamat, where his followers lived, trained, and obeyed without hesitation. They were loyal, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. They could infiltrate castles, monasteries, even royal bedrooms. And when they struck, they didn't flee. They stayed waiting to be caught, smiling as if their deaths didn't matter, because to them it didn't. They believed they were guaranteed paradise. Now imagine being a king, knowing these men could reach you anywhere, even during prayer, even in your own bed. That fear alone changed politics across Europe and the Middle East. Rulers started sleeping in shifting rooms. Tasters tried every meal. Guards never blinked. Because in the medieval world, death didn't knock, it whispered. And while the assassins ruled the East, Europe had its own breed of silent killers, the poisoners. Venice, especially, was infamous. Their poison wasn't seen as cowardly, it was art. Noblewomen kept tiny vials in jeweled necklaces. Courtiers carried powdered death in their rings. A single sip of wine, a single kiss, could end an empire. One of the most feared poisoners was Tofana di Girolamo, known as La Tofana. Her creation, Aqua Tofana, was almost undetectable, slow, silent, and perfect. She sold it disguised as face cream or holy water. Thousands of husbands died, and no one suspected until it was too late. And yet, she was adored by women who saw her as their savior from abusive men. Villain or hero, that depends on who tells the story. Now let's descend even lower, into the criminal guilds. Yes, there were guilds for blacksmiths, bakers, and masons, but there were also guilds for thieves. In Paris, London, and Prague, entire networks of criminals worked together, using secret codes, signals, and safe houses. They had their own leaders, their own oaths, even their own rules. Steal from nobles, good. Steal from the poor, death. They believed they were balancing the world, stealing back what the powerful had taken. And one of the most legendary leaders among them was a man known only as Le Roi des Voleurs, the king of thieves. He was said to move unseen, walk through shadows, and steal from the royal treasury itself. No one ever saw his face. Some say he was a nobleman by day, a thief by night. Others believe he was a myth, a story told by beggars to give hope. But whoever he was, his legend inspired generations of rebels to rise against tyranny. So here's the question. Who was the real criminal in this world? The assassin who killed a corrupt ruler, the thief who robbed a greedy noble, or the king who executed thousands to stay in power? The deeper you go into the medieval underworld, the harder it gets to tell who's evil and who's just surviving. Because in the next part, We'll uncover the criminals who weren't just humans but institutions, where the church itself ran secret prisons, where inquisitors acted as executioners, and where entire towns disappeared overnight under the name of holy justice. You've met the thieves and assassins. Next, you'll meet the system that made them necessary. You see, not all criminals in the Middle Ages hid in shadows. Some wore golden crosses. Some spoke in the name of God. And that's where this story turns darker than ever. Because the most terrifying punishments of that time weren't always given by kings or bandits. They were handed down by men who claimed to serve heaven. Let's go back to the 13th century. Europe is drenched in faith, cathedrals rising, bells echoing, sermons promising eternal life. But behind that beauty was fear. Fear of sin, fear of hell, and fear of the church itself. When the Inquisition was born, its mission sounded noble: protect the faith, purify the soul. But what started as spiritual cleansing became something far more sinister. Imagine a small village. A woman is accused of witchcraft. Maybe her herbs healed someone too quickly, or her eyes were too calm when others panicked. The inquisitors arrive. Riders in black robes carrying scrolls sealed by the Pope himself. They question her, not to find truth but to confirm guilt. Because in their world, doubt was guilt. If she cried, she was hiding something. If she stayed silent, she was possessed. If she spoke boldly, she was a witch. There was no escape. Torture chambers became temples of fear. And the tools, they weren't invented by criminals, they were perfected by priests. The rack, stretching the body until bones cracked like wood. The Iron Maiden, a coffin lined with spikes, disguised as a statue of the Virgin Mary. And the chair of interrogation, covered in hundreds of sharp points, designed to make even sitting unbearable. The idea wasn't to kill, not immediately. It was to break the soul, to force confession, to make people believe their only hope was to agree, even if it meant lying. And yet, here's where the irony burns deepest. While peasants suffered, the very men leading these holy purges lived in luxury. Silk robes, gold chalices, secret feasts behind monastery walls. Some even sold forgiveness. Yes, indulgences, pieces of paper that claimed to erase sin for a price. You could sin today, pay tomorrow, and walk free. And if you were rich enough, even murder had a price tag. That's when the church stopped being a house of God and started becoming the first organized business of fear. Now think about this. The Inquisition didn't just punish, it controlled minds. It taught people to fear questioning, to obey blindly, and to see suffering as sacred. And when faith mixes with power, truth becomes optional. Whole towns vanished, books were burned, bodies buried in silence. And those who dared to speak, philosophers, healers, midwives, were erased from history. Not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient. There's one story that captures this perfectly, the tale of Brother Dominic, a young monk who tried to expose corruption inside his own abbey. He wrote letters to Rome begging the Pope to investigate, but those letters never reached the Vatican. They reached his superior instead. That night, Dominic was taken from his cell. He was never seen again. Weeks later, the abbey declared that he had disappeared into divine solitude. But the villagers knew better. They heard screams echoing from beneath the chapel floor. You see, the line between sinner and saint was fading fast. Faith was power, power was currency, and anyone who threatened that balance disappeared. And here's the real horror: the people believed it was right. They thought this was justice, that pain was purification, that silence was faith. It's a terrifying reminder of how easily truth can be buried under the weight of devotion. But here's the twist I want you to think about. What if I told you that some of the most notorious criminals of the Middle Ages weren't rebels, thieves, or heretics? They were the very architects of justice: knights, bishops, even kings, hiding crimes behind banners of glory. You've seen the prisons. You've heard the screams echo through the dungeons. But now, we move to a place where the crimes were cleaner, silent, hidden behind velvet curtains and golden crowns. Because in the Middle Ages, power wasn't just inherited, it was stolen. Let me paint the scene for you. A cold, misty morning in the royal court of England. The air is thick with the smell of wax and iron. Knights stand in polished armor, their swords gleaming under torchlight. And in the center, on a high throne, sits a king not born a monster but slowly becoming one. His name, King John of England. You may have heard of him, brother of Richard the Lionheart, ruler of a restless kingdom. History calls him cruel, greedy, paranoid. But what most don't realize is that John didn't just rule his people. He bled them dry. Taxes so high that farmers starved. Families torn apart because they couldn't pay for peace. He sold justice to the highest bidder. If you had gold, you were innocent. If you were poor, your life was forfeit. And when nobles began to rebel, John did something unthinkable. He imprisoned their wives and children as bargaining chips. Some were held in towers so cold their skin cracked. Others vanished completely. No graves, no names, no mercy. The same man who swore to protect his land became its worst thief. But here's the twisted part. While peasants feared him, he feared someone else, the church. After he defied the Pope, England was excommunicated. The entire nation cursed. No baptisms, no burials, no blessings. And what did John do? He broke. He begged. He handed over his crown, literally placing it before the Pope's representative, surrendering his kingdom to Rome. That moment marked the death of his pride and the birth of a new kind of ruler, one who used fear, not faith. He once said, "It is better to be hated and obeyed than loved and ignored." And that line became the law of medieval power. But King John wasn't alone. He was just the beginning. Because across Europe, thrones were dripping with crimes disguised as duty. Let's go to France. The 14th century. A king named Philip the Fair. He looked like a saint, handsome, soft-spoken, deeply religious. But behind that gentle face was a mind cold as steel. Philip wanted power, absolute control. And when the Knights Templar stood in his way, he didn't fight them. He erased them. He accused them of witchcraft, heresy, blasphemy, all lies. But the people believed it. The church turned a blind eye. And on a cold March morning, the Templars were burned alive in public. Their screams echoed through Paris as Philip watched silently from his balcony. And when the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was dying in the flames, he cursed the king. He said, "You will follow me within the year." And you know what? He did. Philip was dead before the next winter. Some called it justice. Others called it coincidence. But in the Middle Ages, curses were stronger than swords. And while kings murdered for power, knights, the so-called defenders of honor, became something darker. The Knight of the Black Rose, as they called him, was one of them. A mercenary, once loyal to his lord, until greed poisoned his heart. He killed his own commander in his sleep and sold the castle's defense secrets to the enemy. His payment, a single chest of silver and the life of a woman he loved. But betrayal always collects its debt. When the war ended, his name was erased from every scroll, every memory. No grave, no legacy. Just a whisper that sometimes, in the dead of night, his armored ghost rides through the battlefield he once sold. And that's what makes the medieval world so terrifying. It wasn't filled with monsters from myths. It was filled with people. Kings, priests, knights, all human. But stripped of consequence, they became something else entirely. Because when power has no limits, even faith can be twisted into a weapon. But tell me, if this is what kings and knights did in the light of day, then what do you think happened in the shadows? In secret dungeons beneath castles, in hidden rooms where nobles played God. In the next part, we'll step behind those locked doors, where medieval justice met madness, and punishment itself became an art form of horror. You think justice was blind in the Middle Ages? No, justice had eyes. Cold, watchful eyes hidden behind iron masks and golden crowns. The deeper you go into those castles, the more the air changes. It smells of stone, salt, and something else, fear. The kind that sticks to your skin. And down there, away from the light, is where the real power lived. Because in medieval kingdoms, prisons weren't just for criminals. They were for problems. Rivals, lovers, rebels, anyone who dared to whisper the wrong word. Let me tell you about Lady Eleanor Cobham, once one of the most beautiful women in England. She was married to the Duke of Gloucester, and for a time she tasted everything: jewels, servants, silks. But she wanted more. She wanted the throne. So when her husband's enemies began to close in, she turned to something darker: witchcraft. They said she used potions to make her husband fall deeper in love and charms to curse the king. Was it true? Maybe, maybe not. But in those days, accusations were stronger than proof. She was found guilty not of magic but of ambition. Her punishment: humiliation. She was forced to walk through the streets barefoot, holding a candle, wearing only a thin linen gown. People threw mud and rotten fruit. And then she was locked in a tower for life. No trial, no mercy, just silence. A queen in her mind, a prisoner in reality. And she wasn't alone. Because behind every great man in those times there was a woman who paid the price for his power. In France there was Marguerite Porete, a mystic who dared to write that love was higher than church law. The church didn't debate her, they destroyed her. They tied her to a stake and burned her book before her eyes. She said nothing. Not a scream, not a cry. And in that silence she became immortal. Her name survived longer than those who killed her. It's strange, isn't it? How silence in that age could be louder than any scream. But for some, even death wasn't the end. In Italy, in the city of Florence, lived Benvenuto Cellini, a brilliant artist and silversmith, but also a criminal. He killed a man in cold blood and somehow walked free. How? Because kings needed artists more than they needed justice. He made sculptures for popes, portraits for princes. And while others rotted in chains for stealing bread, he feasted with the powerful. He even wrote in his memoirs, "Men of talent are above the law." Imagine the arrogance, and yet that was the reality of the Renaissance mind creeping into medieval decay. Art became an excuse. Beauty became armor. But not all prisons had walls. Some were born in the mind, the prison of paranoia, fear, and guilt. Take Gilles de Rais, for example, once a nobleman, a war hero who fought beside Joan of Arc, a man admired by thousands. But when the war ended, so did his glory. He turned to alchemy, magic, and darker experiments that can't be named. He believed he could create gold by using life itself as an ingredient. The church. The church found him guilty of countless crimes, so many, they couldn't even count them all aloud. He confessed, not because he was caught, but because he said he heard voices in the dark asking for forgiveness. He was executed in public, and his castle burned to ash. But some say his spirit still haunts those ruins, searching for redemption that never came. And yet, what makes all of this truly haunting isn't the blood or the pain. It's the normalcy of it all. These weren't villains in the shadows. They were lords, knights, poets, even priests. Men who smiled during the day, prayed in the evening, and committed horrors before dawn. They believed what they did was justified. That's the terrifying part. They believed they were right. But what if I told you there was one secret group that thrived in this chaos? A league of spies, assassins, and informants who sold information to the highest bidder, controlling kings from the shadows. They didn't wear crowns, they didn't have thrones, but they held the strings of everyone who did. You've seen the kings. You've heard the screams. You've watched justice bend under gold and power. But what if I told you the real criminals never touched a sword? They never stood in the light, never left their names on a grave. Because their power wasn't in killing, it was in deciding who lived and who died. These were the invisible ones. The whisperers, the poisoners, the spies. Imagine a candle-lit chamber in an old castle, long table, parchment maps, the faint sound of dripping water. And there behind a silk curtain someone speaks softly, a woman's voice. Calm, precise. Deadly, that was Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of a pope, sister of a duke, and the most feared name in Renaissance Italy. To her enemies she was a monster. To her allies an angel. To history a mystery. They said she owned a ring, a golden ring with a tiny hidden needle coated in venom. One handshake and a man's fate was sealed. No blood, no sound, just a quiet end. But was she truly evil? Or just a woman trapped in a world where power was a man's game and poison was her only weapon? Nobody knows. And maybe that's why she survived. But she wasn't alone in her shadowed world. From France to Germany, entire networks of informants and thieves worked in silence, feeding information to the highest bidder. There was the Black Brotherhood, a secret guild of assassins who could vanish into the crowd after a kill. No one knew their faces. They used smoke, disguises, and silence as tools. Some say kings themselves hired them when the law wasn't enough. Some say the church turned a blind eye as long as the death served divine justice. But one thing was clear: power had no mercy. And if you think only men ran the underworld, think again. In the dark alleys of Florence, there were women who dealt in secrets sharper than any blade. They traded gossip for gold, love for leverage, loyalty for silence. One word from them could destroy a knight, a priest, or even a noble family. The city called them the Velvet Wives because their lips spoke softly, but their words cut deep. No one ever punished them, because to expose them meant exposing yourself. And so they thrived dressed in jewels, hidden in plain sight. Then there were the poisoners of Venice, masters of alchemy and deception. They could turn beauty into death, roses, perfumes, wine, even holy water. In one legend, a Venetian widow avenged her husband by creating a love potion, so deadly that it wiped out an entire rival house. The people whispered her name for centuries, calling her the widow's kiss. But here's what's most chilling. None of these people were seen as villains in their time. They were respected. Feared, yes, but respected. Because in the game of survival, they did what everyone secretly wished they could: take control. In those times, information was the deadliest weapon. One secret letter could start a war. One whispered rumor could end a dynasty. One false confession could change history. And behind all of it, someone always pulled the strings. A faceless figure, a hidden benefactor, a shadow no one could ever catch. Some said it was the church. Others believed it was a council of nobles, an early version of what we'd call today an intelligence network. Whatever it was, it knew everything: who betrayed, who confessed, who planned to rise next. And those who came too close to the truth simply vanished. But there's one mystery history still hasn't solved. A single document found centuries later, covered in strange markings, names crossed out, blood stains dried to dust. It hinted that one of these invisible hands wasn't human at all, a symbol so old, even the church feared it. A secret brotherhood that shaped not just the medieval world but the world we live in now. You've seen the thieves. You've seen the murderers. You've seen the ones who ruled by fear. But now, let's talk about those who ruled fear itself. Because the most dangerous criminals of the medieval world weren't the ones who broke the law, they were the ones who wrote it. Imagine this: a grand cathedral at midnight. Candles flicker. Incense swirls through the air. And deep beneath the marble floors, hidden tunnels stretch into the darkness. In those tunnels, hooded figures gather, whispering in Latin, passing scrolls sealed with wax, swearing oaths not to kings or gods, but to each other. They called themselves the Brotherhood of Shadows. To the church, they didn't exist. To the crown, they were loyal servants. But to those who knew, they were the architects of control. The Brotherhood had no flag, no symbol on open display. Their emblem was said to be a single eye carved into stone, an eye that saw all but was never seen. Their members weren't thieves or killers. They were scholars, priests, advisors, men and women who understood one truth: knowledge was power. And in the medieval world, power was everything. They controlled information. They wrote the letters that started wars. They forged signatures that sealed peace. They spread rumors that brought down entire dynasties. And they did it all in silence. Now here's where it gets darker. You've probably heard of the Templars, the warrior monks of the Crusades, men sworn to protect pilgrims and defend the faith. But behind their shining armor and sacred vows, there were whispers. Whispers that they weren't just fighting for God. They were protecting secrets. Gold hidden beneath Jerusalem, ancient relics with forbidden knowledge, Maps, books, even prophecies that could shatter the church's authority if revealed. And some say the Brotherhood of Shadows was born from the ashes of the Templars, after their order was destroyed, burned, and buried by the very church they served. Those who survived went underground, changing their names, rewriting history, becoming ghosts in plain sight. Now pause for a second, because here's where the story stops feeling like history and starts feeling like prophecy. What if I told you some of those ideas, secret orders, shadow councils, coded messages, didn't just end in the Middle Ages? What if they evolved? Think about it. Every empire that rose and fell, Rome, the Papal States, the monarchies of Europe, had one thing in common: someone, somewhere, controlling the information. When the people believed in demons, the church used fear. When they believed in kings, monarchs used bloodlines. And when they began to believe in reason, governments used paper, ink, and silence. The tools changed. The plan didn't. The Brotherhood understood something the rest of the world didn't: that fear is the purest currency. A soldier needs gold. A king needs loyalty. But fear makes people obey without question. That's why punishments were public. That's why executions were theatrical. That's why every act of cruelty we've seen through this entire series wasn't random. It was part of a system. A system designed to remind people of one thing: you are never in control. But even the Brotherhood couldn't predict what would come next. As the centuries turned, knowledge spread. Books replaced scrolls. Printing presses replaced whispers. And with that, secrets started leaking. The powerful had built their empires on silence, but now the world was beginning to speak. And once the truth starts spreading, no shadow can hide forever. So here's the secret that ties everything together. The most notorious criminals of the medieval world were never just thieves or murderers. They were systems, ideas, networks of control. And even today, every time we hear about corruption, manipulation, or secret power, we're hearing an echo of that same medieval darkness. The faces change, the titles change, but the design, it's ancient. So when you think of the Middle Ages, don't just picture castles and knights. Picture the shadows behind them, the whisper in the hall, the letter sealed with wax, the invisible hands that made sure every crown, every sword, every life served a greater design. Because maybe, just maybe, the real medieval criminals were never caught. They just learned how to wear better masks.